Good afternoon from the paddleboard. Now today we are going to be talking about ultralight fishing in the wind. I've been meaning to make a video on this for a long time now, and I'm finally getting around to it. Today might not be fully comprehensive, but I think it'll be a good start to the subject. I'm really just gonna fish this break line here in the wind with an ultralight in hand. I'm gonna talk about kind of some of the things that I like to do, some of the baits that I like to fish, and how you might catch a little bit more fish while ultralight fishing in the wind. Because let's face it, ultralights and wind don't always go hand in hand. Today I'm primarily gonna be catching rock bass, but these tips will apply to pretty much any fish you target. So with that being said, let's get started. So I just rigged up a 1/8 ounce workhorse jig, and I'm putting a little trimmed down portion of a jackworm on there. And I'll talk a little bit more about what my favorite baits are for windy conditions. This is just a good way of getting that thing down there. That 1/8 ounce size is quite large, but let's talk about something that I think is even more important than exactly what you throw. And that, my friends, is positioning. Now, when I say positioning, I'm not necessarily saying just your kayak or your paddleboard or your boat. I'm talking about how you orient yourself against the wind. Now, in this case right here, the wind is coming my way. It's not crazy wind, but it's enough in a paddleboard to make your life a little bit difficult. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cast directly into the wind. You can definitely cast with the wind as well. I don't personally like that very much. What I definitely think is a big no-no for ultralight fishing is actually casting across wind. When you cast it across wind, it creates a lot of headaches as an ultralight angler because your line is constantly getting swept. So right now, because I casted it directly into the wind, my line is coming back directly with the wind. And because I've got a heavier jig on there, I can really feel what it's doing down there. Now, right there, I just hooked into a fish, probably a rock bass. Like I said, we're gonna focus primarily on rock bass today. And there you go. So we're on the board. But I tell you what, that bite would have been extremely hard to feel if I would have been casting it across the wind. It's not to say you won't get bit when you're casting it across the wind. It just makes your line get pushed around in the wind a lot, so it makes your bait less natural, but it also makes it significantly harder to detect bites. So again, that wind is headed this way. I'm gonna cast it straight into the wind, and I'm gonna point my rod tip right at where my bait is. I'm not gonna come out here, I'm not gonna come out here. Positioning is your best friend. Rod positioning, line control. Those are two things that you really gotta focus on. There's another bite, 2 in a row. Like I said, rock bass, you know, we're gonna catch plenty of them out here. To me, it's a good representation of fishing in the wind though, and that is what this video is all about. Ultralight fishing in the wind can be a headache. It doesn't have to be a headache. All right, there you go. I can catch as many of these fish as I want. Wind or no wind, these things are crazy. So aggressive. Always fun on ultralight though. I've been catching them on my bass rod all week, and that's not as fun, but catching them on an ultralight, that's a good time. This is a 6'6" Temple Fork Pastime rod. Same principle applies on the windy conditions no matter what rod you choose. I do like this little bit longer rod for this style of fishing just because I'm making a little bit longer casts and I'm fishing a little deeper water. Now that wind is trying to push me, and it's gonna see what's happening right now is that wind is pushing my paddleboard. It's gonna make it really difficult to fish this thing proper. I can reorient my body on the board, or I can move the board back into a better position. Now I hooked that fish because I still had my jig properly set up and I was really adjusting my rod positioning, but I would never want to cast like that way because the wind's just gonna sweep my line like crazy. So I'm going to reorient my board as soon as I land this fish, and I'm really gonna always pay attention to where's my jig and how am I using my rod and pointing my line to make sure I can feel that bottom contact with that jig. Now, as far as what baits I like to throw, because I know a lot of people are gonna be curious about that, this is a 1/8 ounce workhorse jig, so this is a heavier ultralight jig. You know, you can still use 1/64 and 1/32 in the wind, but I would say all these tips I'm talking about with regards to line control are critically important. You can get away with a little bit more with these heavier jigs, and that's why I'm using this. This is just gonna make it a little easier to fish this deep water, and it's gonna just cut down on the issues from the wind. But if I was throwing a lighter jig, it would be all that much more important for me to cast it straight into the wind and work it back properly. My #1 favorite bait for fishing in the wind though would definitely be an ultralight drop shot. That is just one of my favorite baits in general, but in the wind, it is my favorite. The only reason I'm not using the drop shot now is because I was using it the other day and I wanted to play around with the jig. And the jig is definitely my second favorite for the windy conditions. There's a fish, there you go. He was running with it. There you go. Rocking and rolling, my friends. Just fishing the break line right where the weeds are, and there's enough fish for everybody. There is enough. Ooh, baby, look at that one go. There you go. That is why we use ultralight. There you go. Good times. Rock bass can be fun. Just use the right gear. One of the other things that can definitely help with your presentation is using light line. This is, I want to say 4-pound braid, so it's very, very thin. This is 4-pound copolymer leader. Now, I talk about using that type of line, the low line diameters all the time, but in the wind, when you're fishing those heavier weights and stuff, it's really gonna give you more control of your bait. When you're using those heavier line diameters, it's gonna make it harder to cast, and it's also gonna make it harder to feel your bait in the wind. So those low line diameters make a huge difference, and I've talked about that a ton. But as it relates to windy conditions, I would say it's also important. Now, between the jig and the drop shot, those are both obviously presentations you can use in, you know, deeper water. If I'm fishing shallower water, a lot of times I'm gonna put a Bronco blade on there. I'm gonna throw something that I can move with. You could also throw like a rooster tail or a MEP spinner, whatever that may be. If you wanna fish shallow and aggressive though, the point is you can definitely get away with some of those moving baits. I find that I catch a lot more fish in general with ultralight fishing on slower moving presentations such as jigs and drop shots. So I don't tend to throw a lot of moving baits when it comes to ultralight fishing, but if you like to do that sort of stuff, you can definitely get away with some of those heavier profiles. There's another one. Locked and loaded, baby. Locked and loaded. Let's go. I'm curious if I'll end up catching any smallies while I do this. I'm not counting on it. Smallmouth fishing has been very tough. I'll take whatever rock bass I can get, but if I happen to catch a smallmouth, I'll obviously be very happy. There you go. That's a pretty nice one right there. There's a bite. He had it. Couldn't tell if he was just nipping at it or not. He had it. Them rock bass, they have big mouths. They can suck down a plastic, no issue. There you go. That one's pretty small. Pretty small. See ya, bud. See, right now I've got my line a little crosswind, so I'm having a hard time feeling it. I think one of the things that you gotta do after watching this video is you should go out and practice this a little bit and really cast at different angles. There was a bite. It's a good thing that fish hit it really hard because I did not feel like I had control over my bait at all. He pulled on it a couple times, but as you could tell, I was reeling a little bit, so I kind of reeled up my slack, and that's when I felt the bite. He might have had it before that, but I had slack blown into my line. I would say, like I said, you know, get out and practice this. You know, go out on a windy day and play around and just get a feel for what it feels like to cast at different angles. And I'm telling you, whether you're bank fishing, boat fishing, doesn't matter. The angle of how you cast in the wind for ultralight fishing specifically is so critically important. I would say these same principles apply to finesse bass fishing, but for ultralight it's more important because you're working with lighter line, lighter lures, and everything's just a little bit more challenging, I would say. The more wind you have, the less room for error you have on this light stuff. You know, if you've got a bass rod and you got a 1/2 ounce lure, it doesn't really matter how much the wind is blowing. You can kind of feel what's going on with that thing. The wind feels like it's kind of changing directions every now and again, which makes it a little bit tougher. There you go, he had it. And I'll tell you what, this rod's pretty sensitive. You pair it with that braided fishing line, I feel like it just works well. All right, where you at, buddy? What are you? Little Rocco? Yes, sir. Little Rocco. There you go, little meatball. Mr. Rocco. This one's fighting pretty good. Look at him go. There you go. Yeah, look at him go. Hello, Mr. Rocco. There you go. I'm gonna smell like rock bass when I get back. They keep slapping my legs. So I cast it out there. Now I'm gonna point my rod like right at where I cast it. Keep my line low out of the wind and just let my jig get down to the bottom. Once my line stops moving, once I feel it hits the bottom, now that's when I'm gonna kind of pick it up a little bit and I'm gonna jig it. But I'm gonna keep my line relatively low and out of the wind. And I'm just gonna try to, sometimes I just put like a slight angle on it. So my line's coming off like this, but I still point it pretty much towards that jig. I wanna have a little bit of an angle just so I can feel things a little bit better, because when it kind of has that point of contact between your line and your rod tip, you might be able to feel that bite a little bit better. But I'm keeping my rod pretty low, just keeping the line out of the wind. The more line you have up in the wind, the more that it's gonna get moved around and pushed around, and you're gonna lose some of that feel. And I'm feeling this jig is kind of bouncing on the bottom. I'm getting some bites. Does he have it? I think he does. He does have it. I think he grabbed it and kind of started coming towards me. I think it's a little one. Yeah, look at that. I felt that bite. Little rock bass. I felt that bite down there. Despite the wind, despite the boat waves. And it's because of how I oriented my rod positioning and how I was controlling my line. One more thing I'll definitely say is don't feel like you have to cast it super far. You know, I talk about castability with light lines and stuff like that, but so many times I think people forget that you don't have to cast it a mile to catch fish. More often than not, the shorter cast can give you a lot better sense of control, and if you're able to hit the strike zone, then you should execute a shorter cast. That one, I didn't even hardly feel a bite. Dadgum, that was out deeper. I just felt a little pressure, so I set the hook. There you go. All right, that's a little bit bigger one. He's not too big. I've caught some giants out here, but I'll tell you what, that one was in a little deeper water. Gotcha. Another one, 2 in a row. Man, these ones out deeper seem like they put up a little bit better fight off the get-go. Let's see, what do we got here? What do we got here? How big are you? These deeper ones have definitely been fighting a little harder. They're fat and they turn sideways, and then it just feels like you hooked into a big piece of meat. Gotcha, that one was just holding on to it. Golly, they definitely give me a little bit more trouble down there in the depths. Look at that, holy smokes. That was the best pull yet. Good on you, Mr. Rocco, good on you. Love to see it, there you go. That's a better one. Hey man, I'm not gonna tell you that rock bass are anything fancy, but on ultralight, I like them. I like them. I never grew up with these fish back in Kansas. Up here in Michigan, there's a lot of them, and they can be a lot of fun. Keep it simple, catch some rock bass, nothing wrong with that. Thanks for the fight, buddy. At first, the wind was coming in this way. Now it's coming this way. And it's kind of annoying. I'm not gonna lie. Oh, wow. Wow, that one grabbed it and took off. That was crazy. My line was not all the way on the bottom, and all of a sudden it started taking off. I could tell my jig was actually being swept with the wind in that case. And this fish just intercepted it. That was awesome. I tell you what, folks, I had an absolute blast up here in northern Michigan, but that fish is gonna be the last one that we catch on camera. If you have more questions about ultralight fishing in the wind, feel free to drop a comment below. Like I said, I might touch on this subject more in the future, so stay tuned for all things ultralight and all things multi-species. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. We'll catch you next time.
Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position.